The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we discuss mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield. I'm here as always with my co-host John Cuna. Today we'll be discussing youth mental health, specifically the youth mental health epidemic, right, as it's been deemed, at least in the United States. Recently, the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, came out and deemed youth mental health an epidemic within the United States. I believe this was like a week ago, maybe a little bit more.
Yep.
And gave some information about, why that is. We're going to get into what we think are the causes, what we think maybe are the solutions, as well as some other kind of, related topics. But John, I want to kick it to you first to discuss a little bit about the fact that the Surgeon General has gone this far to deem it an epidemic, something we've been paying attention to for a while and probably thought it was there for a while. And just what you think about that, as well as maybe some data that you found, based on what he said.
Yeah, I think, you and I have talked a lot about this, like off air and with other clinicians and other colleagues sort of in the area that, we sort of knew this data was going to be coming out, and now we have it, and it's really scary. But we knew that there was going to be some pretty traumatic and huge spikes in anxiety, depression, especially because of from the pandemic and from other reasons too that we'll get into. But I thought it was really good. Sad that it has to happen, but good that he came out and was talking about this. He actually wrote a 53-page report. And some of the stuff that came out that was that symptoms of anxiety and depression have since doubled since 2019. Suicide attempts in adolescent girls are up 51%. 51% since 2019. That's only in 2 years. It's gone up over half, and 4% higher for adolescent boys, which is scary. We knew the numbers were going to be bad. I don't know if we knew they were going to be this bad, and I don't necessarily see them going in a direction down anytime soon. I feel like this is a place that it's great that we're naming it finally, and it feels like more people are understanding the need to. And he talks about this in one of his speeches and one of his talks about this, of like, we feel like we're just replacing one pandemic for another, or one epidemic for another. With we've gone from COVID, and now we're moving into mental health, specifically with adolescents. And so it's we'll get into some of the stats, the scary stuff. We'll get into some of the things we think could be really helpful. But those were jarring to see, to say the least, especially for when you're looking at suicide attempts for adolescent females was really scary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime you see an increase in suicidality or suicide attempts, it's unbelievable because you see 4% compared to 51, and the natural reaction is like, 4%, not that bad. 4% that's bad news. Then you get into 51% for adolescent females, and that's really scary. We've talked in the past about how suicide attempts have been up across the board. I think we talked about that in at least one past episode. We did discuss how with young youth females, the numbers were already concerning. So it's good that they're actually calling official attention to this, because it's a problem that needs to be solved. It's not just youth either. I think, males in that probably 30 to 55 range, the numbers are bad too. Definitely more than a 4% increase.
Yep.
And it's, I think if we try to figure out why adolescent females are more affected, I would guess, we've talked a little bit about this, social media being sort of, not to blame social media on everything, but like it's kind of the culprit here, where particularly among young girls, the way they talk to each other and the back channeling and the different like toxic things that happen in terms of their communication through the medium of social media has definitely correlated, in my opinion, with this increase in suicidality and worsening mental health. And that's an issue that I don't know what the immediate solution is. I think that's where we're going to discuss what we think are the causes of this. We'll talk about potential solutions. I think some solutions are things that we can try to do collectively or individually right away. Others are like just hope for it to organically happen. There are just certain things that you you can't just take a step collectively and hope for it to change right away. Things sort of have to gradually change on their own. We've talked about this a lot when it comes to mental health in general, right? With the stigma reducing.
Yep.
We can scream until we're blue in the face, but that doesn't mean it's going to reduce. Sometimes you have to have natural organic shift in these things, and that doesn't happen quickly. And I think screaming in certain ways can help, but it's only going to be, part of a short-term thing that contributes to a larger change over 10 years or 20 years, which we've seen, particularly over the last 5 years. Things have really changed much more quickly than the last 20 before it, right?
Yeah, agreed.
So in terms of causes, what comes to mind for you? I'll kind of let you go first, and then I'll try to dovetail. But what do you think are the major causes when it comes to, what is leading to us having a mental health epidemic amongst youth in the United States?
I would say, I'll get to the social media piece because I have a lot of thoughts on that too. But I think that it's the undercurrent has always been there. Mm-hmm. I think youth especially has been a really vulnerable period of time for a long time, and it's been sort of waiting. Have you ever seen Ghostbusters 2 where it has that pink goo underneath the sewers? That's kind of what it feels like.
Yeah,
and now we're
analogy.
at the moment where it's taking over the building, and it's the problem with it is that now it's these kids were then in their houses away from other things that would have maybe distracted them from it or getting joy or any of those types of things. They were locked in their house forever, for a year, seemingly forever. And they lost. So a lot of people who maybe they played sports or they played in the neighborhood with friends or they had extracurriculars that they really enjoyed. Now all of a sudden they can't really do those to the same capacity. And with social media dovetailing is sort of there as hey, here's the solution to your problems. To, the amount of times that I heard parents say well, I'll let them play more video games or I'll let them be on social media more because it's that's how they're socializing now. Mm-hmm. And it's not really, it is socializing to a certain extent. And this is probably a whole other episode to talk about how social media is your digital identity is going to be as valued as your physical one. Seemingly, it seems like it's scarily going down that road. Mm-hmm. But you had a lot of people removed from everything and were stuck in their house, and they were forced to be confronted with all the stuff that was probably that undercurrent, symptoms of stress or anxiety or depression or all these different things that they were probably either slightly aware of or not, but were sort of managing because they were leaving their house, they were walking around, they were distracted, they were interacting with friends, they were doing all these different things, and then all of a sudden that just stopped altogether, cold turkey, and there was nowhere else to go. And so then they went to social media to stay connected with people, and I think that presented an enormous problem. Mm-hmm. I'm not as familiar with it, but I know enough about it. The stuff that was going on with Facebook and the whistleblower, they were specifically targeting adolescent girls. Right? Yeah. That's a proven now fact. It's no longer, we kind of have always known that they were doing stuff like that. Now we know. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't surprise me, unfortunately, that the rates are up that much for adolescent girls because they were targeted specifically through. Was that
Facebook and Instagram, or just Facebook, or?
I believe Facebook
it was, owns Instagram.
Yeah, I believe it's all the same. It's all the same stuff. Okay. Same monster. They were specifically designed for that. And we'll get into. I'll get into some tips and tricks and some stuff that I've used with people specific to social media and how to manage those platforms rather than just it's the devil and cold turkey and don't go on it, because that's not necessarily realistic, but there are ways that you can sort of manage it. But I would say that that's the biggest one. And I've talked about this before. I work with a lot of athletes, and that was their biggest loss. It was almost like a loss of a loved one. Mm-hmm. They couldn't play anymore, and then they're stuck in their house. They're managing their depression or anxiety through being able to play a sport, and then that's gone. And it was just a perfect storm for a lot of these kids.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to I'll circle back to a couple of points you made, but one I just want to stick on right now is as you're talking about it, what point, if at all, do we look at Facebook like we look at the Sackler family when it comes to opiates? Yeah. Opiates, right? At what point?
Getting close.
Right? Because it's we look at the opioid epidemic and what was caused with, obviously the shady stuff that was going on with that family and Purdue Pharma and all the things where, they were clearly, they knew it was addictive and they were getting people hooked, and it's led to this massive issue and lots of death. At what point do we look at Facebook if suicidality is up 51%, those are pretty staggering numbers. It's hard to draw a direct line and blame them, but, there's enough there to be what the hell, in my opinion. I don't know that it's ever going to get that far, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard, right? Because they'll always say like, we didn't force them to go on, and they'll blame everybody else besides themselves.
Yeah.
But the stats don't lie. Direct correlation between prolonged exposure to Facebook and increased symptoms of depression, and then depression untreated can lead to suicidality. And we have all the information now, so it's hard not to be able to see that type of stuff. And the parallels are pretty close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about digital identity, and we've had discussions back and forth more recently about the concept of Web3 and, blockchain and where things are going to go in terms of there being a tipping point. I mean, Facebook even changing its name to Meta, and, all this talk about the metaverse and how we're already at that point, possibly. I think we're already past that point where people's online, certain generations so far, I think the older generations are kind of stuck in the old ways, but younger generations, online personality or online identity is probably equally, if not, I would say more important already than their in real life personalities, right? So we talk about digital identity versus IRL in real life. I think that is what scares me the most, because it's like, it's hard enough to have your in real life identity and manage that, right? Let alone having a digital one that's probably different than your real one.
Right.
And that you have to feel, I think what really burns a lot of young kids out, especially, or people in general, is the need to have to upkeep that, right? There's a status thing that always, it's like grow or die. It's almost like your own business, right? We talk about athletes as brands. We talk about that a lot. It's almost like young people feel the need to brand themselves online and have that going. And there's only one direction you can go in before you start to get demoralized. If your follower count, your likes, all that stuff is going downward, what is that going to do to the psyche of a young person? It's nothing good, right? So there's this, and even if it's going up, the endless chase to keep it going up, it has to be draining for someone that young. I can't imagine, I'm 38. I can't imagine having to deal with that when I was younger, whether it's the upkeep of that or just the reality of being able to see when you're not included, right? You ever heard about snap maps and on Snapchat and when you can see look, friends who are best friends don't hang out all the time. That actually doesn't mean anything.
Right.
But when it's shoved in your face and you're young and immature and you don't have a secure sense of self, which we're actually going to get into the next episode. We're going to talk about confidence and I like to think of having a secure sense of self as a better way of saying confidence, but we'll get into that. When you don't have that when you're young, because who does before they're like 25 typically, let alone like definitely not before 18, and you see a map of all your friends kind of hanging, or some of your friends hanging out, and you were invited, what are you going to think? I mean, like that, they're just shoving things in people's faces that they're just not equipped to handle, and it's really not fair. And a lot of it doesn't mean anything, but the imagination takes over and it's going to go that direction. So I agree with you. That digital identity versus in real life identity, it's not healthy to expect young people to balance both those, let alone one. And we've talked about how when you get to a place of security or confidence, what really happens is your obsession with yourself or self-development kind of goes to the wayside, and you start focusing on how to help other people. And that actually, enlightens your life and uplifts your life and your happiness a lot more, ironically. The more you get away from trying to fixate on self. Is there a little bit of self-development that needs to happen to get to a secure place? Absolutely.
Sure.
But most people fail to realize when they get there that the next step is actually to go try to help other people and focus less on yourself.
Right.
So if we're focusing on two versions of ourselves, that's going in the wrong direction from where people need to be healthy.
Yeah, it just feeds into I remember when I was like, if I'm my, teen years and like being wildly insecure about myself, and like it was hard enough without this stuff to like try to present like I was perfect and everything was perfect, like everything was going well, let alone try to do it in two different places at the same time. It's impossible. And it puts an enormous amount of worth in the wrong things. And I know we're going to get into confidence in the next one too, but it's just self-defeating. And we now have, and again, not trying to put all the blame onto social media, we're also talking trauma, loss, tons of death, like that type of stuff, obviously contributing to the spike in mental health crisis for kids as well, like just the sheer amount of death that we've been surrounded by too. So like not just only putting it on social media, but we're seeing the data now of leaning on social media as a place to like socialize and to stay connected. We're seeing that where we have the actual research-backed data to prove why it's not an effective way to feel connected or to stay connected. That was the big lie that we were told by those things. Yep. Absolutely. Like you'll get to stay connected. You'll talk to friends that you haven't talked to in years. And it's like, well, there's probably a reason I haven't talked to this person in 15 years. It's because I probably don't want to talk to this person in 15, And so that was sort of the big lie. I agree. perfect example, like the Trojan horse that got us hooked into it, and then
Yep.
it's just like systematically disseminated connections amongst people. It's been terrible.
Absolutely. And you just touched on how, obviously we're going to look at other causes besides social media being the biggest one, and social media and COVID, I would say, are the biggest ones. But you talked about, you gave that analogy of Ghostbusters 2 with the pink goo sort of like building underneath. Shout out to the people from that generation. I think anyone who's under
we're dating
50 is
ourselves
probably like, what
time.
the hell is this dude talking about? But I get you. And I think some of our listeners will definitely get that. But when that pink goo is underlying its building and you don't see it building, I think that's a great metaphor for kind of mental health in general.
Yeah.
But definitely this issue. And so let's talk about like social media. Like I think of like when I think of causes of like what is driving this youth mental health epidemic, I think short term, medium term, and long term in the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
So short term in the past is COVID, right? That's the last 2 years. Medium term is social media because that really started to turn, I would say, Facebook came out around 2004, but it was kind of like 2010 when that stuff started to really start to turn, and probably 2014 when you started to see bad numbers kick in with regard to suicidality and young females as well when it comes to their mental health. So that's like medium term in the past, social media. But then we get into some other stuff that goes even farther back. I think we've discussed this in one episode, but I think about just the gradual declining like level of resilience and independence in our youth. And that we've talked about, it really started probably in the, I would say, early 80s to late 80s, early 90s, I would say, maybe is when it started. Definitely got worse in the mid 90s to late 90s. And there's a book about this called The Coddling of the American Mind. Have you read this?
No, okay. I've heard of it, though.
It's by Jonathan Haidt, and he also wrote a book called The Happiness Hypothesis. He's got some really cool books. So The Coddling of the American Mind kind of goes into, this is painting with a broad brush, but it kind of goes into how gradually from the I would say mid late 80s and getting worse into the late 90s and early 2000s and up to today, parents more and more started to get really freaked out by news media reports about abductions and abuse and things like that from strangers and things like if I let my kid out to go roam the town and just be independent and have fun and connect with his friends, something bad will happen. That sort of, worry and fear kept going up and up and up. Even though if you look at the numbers, it was really, the numbers were not changing in terms of the incident level of that happening. The awareness of it and the news media coverage of it was going up. Right. And so that's what led to parents collectively across the U.S. anyway, getting really freaked out. This is also coincides with like less hitchhiking and like some of these things were really good that those happened. But one of the, how often do we sort of reflect on things where short term in terms of changes in policy and other things probably helps things, but long term it can form these bad habits that we don't even see happening until it's too late. Again, the example of the pink goo sort of like lying underneath dormant and bubbling up until it's too late. So what happened was more and more over the last 3 decades especially, parents have given kids less freedom and less opportunity to have unsupervised playtime, right? Where they have to just be no parent, even within visual distance, right? Overseeing it, just be able to be around and hang out with each other and problem solve and that kind of thing. That breeds almost like an emotional immune system, right? Emotional, psychological immune system, so that when you get to other things later on, mental health challenges, transitions in life, adjustment, loss, conflict, you know how to handle it, right? Whereas if you're robbed of that opportunity, similar to how if you like rob a young kid of the opportunity to like be exposed to germs because you're just dousing them in hand sanitizer head to toe they tend to have more physical issues as they grow up because their immune system, I think, right? Because their immune system didn't develop appropriately because it wasn't exposed to certain things. So that is definitely, to me, one of the longer term issues I think plays a role. Is it the biggest thing? No, I don't think so, but definitely hasn't helped because I think it's led to youth being less equipped to deal with, transitions or conflict or adversity as it comes in the form of COVID and things like that. We have social media, we have COVID short term in the past and now, social media medium term in the past and now, and then we have declining resilience and independence coming in the form of fewer opportunities to be independent and develop that kind of resilience. Then we have a few other things that I think relate. We have unbalanced lives. We've talked about how this is in the United States, and it's not every single community, but a lot of communities, kids are just asked to do too much. They're starting to look into colleges in their sophomore year, freshman year in high school. They have to play sports, often only one sport, right? We talked about specialization, and their schedules are packed because they're playing that year round, and they have private coaches, and they have this. They're studying for SATs as of their freshman year. It's just like, they're in Russian math, and it's like too many things, right? So unbalanced lives, a lack of physical activity, so not enough physical activity or too much of the same physical activity as one thing we've talked about, which can contribute overall to stress levels, but can also lead more susceptible to injury. You've talked a lot about the
burnout too.
And the psychological impact of injury. That stuff matters. And then we have, I would say, mental health care, right, is still not where it needs to be. So access to care is a huge problem, and quality of care is still a huge problem, right? So as these mental health issues are getting worse, there's not enough people for them to go to. We've seen this in our work, where it's like we try to keep up by hiring the right people to meet the demand of all these people struggling. And we're trying our best, but it's like, if you call around, it's hard for people to find someone that has availability. So that's a problem.
We're not going to see a dump of new clinicians into the field probably for the next few years.
Correct.
It's like, it's a great time to get into it, but then I got to go back to school for 3 years. Then I got to do 2 years of then it's like, we're not going to see the supports until
2025.
Right. Until it's too late.
Correct. There's going to be a boomerang effect where a lot of people, which is a good thing, see that they have to get into this field because it's an opportunity.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity to help people. That's like a great combination.
Right.
But there is, like you said, there's a delay to that. And so what the hell is going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years? Because until we have more people to meet that demand, it's going to be tough. And then the last thing is, this is going to be a little bit controversial, so I want to talk about it a little more and see what your thoughts are. But I actually think the increase in mental health awareness has both helped and hurt. And so what I mean by that is, like, to me, we've talked a lot about how in therapy, sometimes you have to take a step back before you can take a step forward, right? When you start to unpack and learn about these things, it can hit you pretty hard. And before you start to feel better, you actually can feel worse often.
I'd say most of the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Physical exercise can be like that too. A lot of people quit the gym because the month of January sucks, right? You're sore all the time.
Yeah.
Your body hasn't adapted yet. Yeah. And is that a good thing long-term?
You're not seeing gains. You're not doing
Correct.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Yep. So is that a good thing long-term? Yes, because it means you're taking that first step back and your body can't handle it, but it's going to help propel you 3 steps forward physically.
Right. Yep.
Mental health is the same thing. When you get into therapy, particularly as you get older, it's been a longer time since you've actually ever gotten into it and unpacked it. The first 2 months can kind of suck. You're uncovering a lot of stuff that's been buried down. So I think what's happening is there's a collective version of this, I think, in my opinion. This is not based on anything, in data. It's just my opinion that I think as we've reduced the stigma and started to buy into mental health, I think collectively we're in this phase where, like, we've kind of taken one step back because everyone's now aware of it, but they haven't quite got through that the collective equivalent of January at the gym. We're not quite through that yet, particularly because COVID has also probably extended January into March, and so it's impossible for people to get through that phase. And what I think that's led to is, again, the collective one step back before we take 2 steps forward. So eventually we're going to take 2 steps forward, but we're kind of in the step back right now collectively, which leads to numbers that look very bad. And then there's also, amongst youth, there's also the competition piece we've talked about, where mental health has kind of become this badge of honor that I think people use in their online personality or their online identity as a way to keep building their brand, so to speak. And that is not a good thing, right? It really can't be weaponized in that way or used for some other ulterior gain. It's got to just be an authentic, like, no, this is my mental health and I need to work on it. So,
Yeah, I definitely, a few things, right? First is 100%.
There's a lot there.
Yeah. The first one that I want to latch to is I love the January analogy because therapy is literally the exact same thing. And the amount of times that sometimes you're working with someone in the first couple of weeks, they'll come in and be like, this is really difficult. And like, I don't feel that much better. And it's like, yeah, well, you didn't really know what we needed to talk about until we got in there and started diving in. And it can be quite painful as you're addressing things that, especially like you said, later in life that you've been, avoiding, either consciously or unconsciously avoiding for a long period of time. Of course, it's going to be really difficult to bring that stuff up. But I think the going to the gym is a perfect analogy because the same reasons that people quit therapy, the same reasons that people quit going to the gym. They don't see gains. It's ridiculously hard. It's excruciating. It's exhausting. And your body hasn't adapted to it yet. And just like everything else, therapy takes practice too. And you just have to continue to be consistent and resilient and kind of go from there. And what you said about the collective piece of, I think is an interesting point too. I definitely think that we have tendencies to like over calibrate when we're talking about like big conversations. And I think that I could see that happening for mental health. Like we're over calibrating a little bit. And
can you explain what that means?
Yeah, I think Well, one, I think we're still stuck in this, like, not addressing the problem in the correct way. I think we're trying to, like, tread water with a few bricks over our heads right now is what it kind of feels like. Is we're not really approaching it in the right way. It's just people in the field know what we're talking about. Where, like, you talk to any professional in the field right now, we're inundated, we're swamped, we're crazy, everyone's overbooked, has too many clients right now. We're trying to keep up. So that's one. And rather than sort of approaching it from what we've talked about of, like, we need to get ahead of the conversation in one end, because we need to, I'm worried about the impact of this influencing how we address mental health in the future. And I don't see enough people talking about it in the way that I feel like we talk about it, which maybe I'm a little bit biased, but feel like it's the appropriate way, which is talking about, like, why are we waiting for something? Why are we waiting for the pink goo to rise above the streets? Why aren't we popping the lid, getting down there and clearing stuff out before it gets to that point? And so I think the collective tends to be fear-based, overreactive in pieces like that. And I fear the same. I fear that will become, like, we need to do all these different changes and do all these different things for mental health, and it won't be guided in the best practice or be guided by the people that actually know what they're talking about. Like, policies will come into play and all these different things will be influencing the direction of mental health. And I am worried that that's going to not be in the best way. Yeah,
no, it's a fair concern. Again, we talked in the beginning of this episode about how sometimes solutions that look good short term end up having unintended consequences. And some of those you can't plan for, but others you can, by having, like, more in-depth dialogue with professionals and people that really have worked in this field and have a finger to the pulse of what's going on.
Yeah. And the other thing that you mentioned too, like the collective too, like, we're uncovering all of this stuff and it's drawing up a lot for people, and it's putting on, like, oh, I don't want to have too much of this. So I definitely see that. And then definitely the badge of honor thing. It's, when I was going through school, it was sleep. Like, that was your badge of honor. Like, if you didn't get a lot of sleep, it meant that you were, like, doing more work or you were better. Like, if you had less sleep,
which we're going to talk about in the next episode.
It's like, well, little teaser for you guys. But craziness. And then you have people, and then so now it's like, well, I'm depressed. Oh, I'm more depressed. Like, oh, have you done inpatient or have you done programming? No. Oh, I did. Right. And it's just like this. It's like, great that you feel comfortable talking about your experience, I guess, but it's being done in a way to, like, as a competition, to put yourself on this hierarchy of,
I never thought about it like that, but you're right. It's the exact same thing as the sleep thing. It's this badge of honor that, like, we're people for a long time and still to this day. We're going to give an example. Rick Ross is an example I'm going to give in the next episode about, like, just talking about not sleeping as this badge of honor, as this proof of hard work and that kind of thing. And the youth are using mental health like that. Like, the more inpatient programs you've been to, the more you've struggled, the more you're advanced or tough, or I don't know. I don't know what it is.
I don't know. I think it's just like a
attention grab, maybe.
A way to just I think that's part of, when you're talking about getting into college and it's all about, like, where you fall on this scale. I feel like that translates to everything and all the conversations that kids are having about, like, well, I want to make sure that I'm the top, even if it means that I'm the most depressed or I'm not getting I'm getting the least amount of sleep or whatever.
Yeah. It just, I've been through the most.
Yeah. Right. I've been through it's a fascinating conversation. I've tried to gain some insight into it with clients who have said stuff like that. I'm like, please help me understand, like, are these the kind of conversations that are going on, and why are they happening essentially? And no one can really give me, like, a straight answer other than like, oh, it's just kind of like how we talk and things like that. It's fascinating.
It's interesting. So, solutions wise, I mean, it's hard, right? We talked about how there's organic solutions, there's forced solutions. Forced solutions may be good short term, but can cause long term implications that we can't see off the bat, or hopefully we can see if we brainstorm together. I think, to me, one of the organic solutions I hope happens is that I'm always impressed by how, younger youth generations sort of sometimes have this uncanny ability to shift trends, to, like, sort of be fed up with the status quo and just decide to do things a different way. Sometimes it comes in ways that don't, like, have as much of a collective well-being impact for health overall, like fashion, music, fashion, stuff like that.
Right. The mullet seems to be coming back, which I'm not a fan of, but I've seen more of it. Or the fanny pack is another perfect example. Right? It's now cool again. Yeah.
Exactly. So things can be cyclical. There was an example of, like, I forget if it was, like, the millennial generation or Gen Z or something like that, like, started downsizing their house and didn't want to own a lot of things. Like, I think that's an example of, like, they saw the McMansion generation and with like hoarding, stuff and having multiple storage facilities and whatever. And they're like, all set. I'm going to live in a tiny house and not have much to my name at all in terms of owning material possessions. Right. So that's an example where I'm hoping that younger generations, learn about mental health, listen to podcasts like this where we're talking about it, have productive conversations amongst their peers, not badge of honor conversations, but productive conversations about mental health, and decide to do things differently. And where that happens, I think, is exactly what you've been touting this into. It's prehab stuff. Yeah. They start to say, like, why are we all, trying to brag about negative mental health and or waiting too long to deal with stuff? Mm-hmm. Let's be honest about it. Do it for the right reasons, and then take steps proactively to keep ourselves in a good place. I think that's going to happen. I don't know when, but I think the younger generation now is going to see what happened during COVID and the generations in front of them, and they'll be like, nah, not doing it that way.
I think they're intelligent enough. I think they've got the capacity to like really shift the focus of how we see everything, including mental health, from why are we waiting? Why aren't we just tackling this stuff now? So that inevitably it just leads to like self-awareness and self-actualization of like being able to observe yourself from a better place and a more honest place, and then have the tools to be able to address fears, insecurities, whatever comes up. Yeah. Rather than being like, I don't know how to do that, first of all, or if I do, I go into a panic and then don't want to address it at all, and then wait for it to not have any control over it, and then have to go see somebody for it. Right? Like that's old hat. That's the old way of doing things.
Exactly.
Just can't continue to do it that way.
No, I agree. And I think mutual aid is a concept that I think is going to play a huge role, right? We've talked about more recently, especially how important young groups for young guys are going to be in terms of being able to talk about mental health amongst each other. Mm-hmm. That's still an area where it doesn't happen enough. And I think especially amongst young females, that's going to be important. We know a group, it's Pam Wilsey and Vanessa Kalanya out of Newton, who run, I think it's called Wilsey Connections. It's definitely called Wilsey Connections. So they run they do individual work with young, female adolescents and into high school and college as well. But they also do groups. And I think that's like such an important thing for, it's the only thing that's going to counteract all the negative tendencies that's happening on social media collectively amongst young females. And I think males too. I think groups are the answer. I think if we start getting them talking in a guided way amongst each other about important topics, that's going to be part of the solution.
It was funny. This is going to date myself too, and it made me feel super old, but it was a great thing. I like walked in, I was getting late night and bringing ice cream home for myself and my spouse, and walked into the ice cream place, and it was like maybe 5 or 6 like high school students just like talking to one another, and like one of them was sharing that they had a really hard day, and the other one was like they were all like supportive, and I was like, this is great. I was like, we need more of this. They were high school age, so probably I'd probably peg them around between like 15, 16 years old. Yep. And I was like, man, this is exactly what needs to happen more. Like just kids getting together and talking like in person and having more of those just like real conversations. Made me feel a little bit old, because I was like, this stuff used to happen all the time, and it feels like it's like the minority of those experiences now.
Absolutely. And I think one other thing that could help, I feel like youth in general are working less. And I think do you get that vibe too? Yeah. So especially that probably goes hand in hand with parents being a little bit too obsessed about college planning and all this stuff. So it's like their schedule's so packed there is no time for a job. Right. I think that's a huge misstep in terms of not working before you're 18 or 19. Like, it's good to have a job at 16, 17. Yeah. You're not going to make a lot of money, but that's not the point. Like, you develop problem-solving skills, right? It's an example of unsupervised stuff that we talked about earlier, because your parents aren't going to be on your job site, and you just have to figure stuff out. Like, if your boss sucks, how do you deal with it? If a coworker is dramatic and they're causing issues for you, how do you problem solve that? If you're managing stress because you're a cashier or something, how do you manage stress? Like, it teaches you on the fly how to do things that are really key to mental health and resilience that you can't read out of a book. Right. I'm sorry. Right. And you can't really talk about it in a group either. You just have to go do some of these things. Yep. And this relates to, like, we're going to talk a little bit as we finish this episode up about like the mass job exodus that's happened. I think a lot of people, particularly lower paying jobs and service industry jobs, people are just quitting those jobs. And I don't blame them, because they're not getting paid enough. No. And they're dealing with, I think customers overall in the service industry have completely gone off the deep end when it comes to how they treat service sector workers. I don't want to get into why, because there could be some political undertones. It's just not even worth going there. But it seems like, COVID might have factored in too. I think people's collective mental health is not a good place. So are they more likely to snap? And probably, right?
Yep.
There's a lot of things going into that, but it's led to people quitting jobs. And so I think people in general have quit service sector jobs. Young people are working less. There's a ref shortage nationwide for youth sports. I kind of want to get your thoughts about that because it kind of reflects on a lot of this stuff. Have you read about that at all?
Just a little bit, but you go ahead. You can give the synopsis.
Well, so basically, like for youth sports in the United States, nationwide, there is a shortage of people who are willing to ref games. Now, that could be about money. I don't think it is. I would guess it's about how they're being treated because parents are, before the pandemic already were, I'm sure it's just gotten worse, are ridiculous when it comes to how seriously they take things. I would guess this is probably mostly heterosexual male, dads, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? Is that fair? Am
fair.
I going on a limb with that one?
I don't know. I think that's probably fair.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Right. So overall, parents are just berating refs, and so they're quitting. And it's led to like games having to be canceled because there's no one to ref the game. Mm-hmm. And so I think it relates to the sort of mass job exodus, which relates to youth mental health. I think if parents are doing that in a game, I can't imagine that helps the overall mental health of the players. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, as a player with a passionate father playing soccer growing up, I can understand. He's had a few games where he was politely asked to leave for yelling. It makes total sense, right? At some point, there's a breaking point of how much you can just take. Yeah. And I think as we've talked about youth mental health or youth sports beforehand too. But I think that youth sports has become something different than what it's intended to be. It's intended to be a place that kids come together, have fun, learn some, personal skills, interpersonal skills, goal setting, how to work together as a collective, have fun and leave. And that's it. It is not that anymore.
Yeah.
These sports, with the introductions of like AAU programs and the club system specifically for soccer, it's like everything these kids are doing are geared towards like becoming a professional or helping them get into college. Like that's the track. And when I have conversations with coaches, because I coached for like 10 years and I definitely saw a lot of this as a coach, like parents coming up and telling me like, what do they need to do because this coach from such and such a college is telling them that they need this and this type of stuff. And it was just like, what is going on? That they're seeing the same things. Kids are having less fun. They're not being as consistent, right? Because they have 15 other things that they're doing. So their commitment to being able to be a part of the team, they'll come like 3 days a week, or they'll come like twice a week rather than every day during the week, which was pretty typical. Yep. I would never have considered thinking, because I was part of a team, to like not go to some practices or games because I had other commitments. That was the whole point. And I had a coach. He had some faults, but one of his things that he was really strong on was commitment, and that if you committed to a team, that was a commitment. And he wasn't very lax on like if you had to do other things or all these different things. And I think that kids are, because you mentioned this beforehand, are overscheduled with like they have to have 1,000 things on their resume by age 8 years old. That you're seeing a lot of this stuff, and then it comes out with parents who view sports that way. And again, massive paintbrush. I'm not saying that every parent is like this, but I definitely think that the majority has switched into this type of mentality where they're now, the ref is there to like help their kid get into college somehow, as like twisted as that sounds. But it's, if there's not the right call for Timmy, then dad's going to be, poor Timmy, man. Poor Timmy. We got to write a book about Timmy on all the things that go on for him. But, so dad is, or even mom or anyone really, like yelling at the ref because, things like the tackle or that was a goal, it wasn't offside, or whatever it happens to be. And I'm speaking specifically about soccer, but it happens in all sports. And I feel like we hear stories like if that wasn't even that long ago, where like a dad went to jail because he killed a guy because he got into a fight with like what are we doing here? And that's another thing that we've talked about youth sports before. But if I'm a ref, I don't want to be yelled at for 2 hours. Like, I don't want to be doing that. No. I want to go in there and have some fun and, be a part of a game and, things like that. I don't want to be having to deal with Timmy's dad yelling at me for 2 hours, telling me I'm a, awful person.
Exactly.
And, all these things. So it makes sense. And it's too bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the record, Timmy is not a real person.
No.
We've worked with. Timmy is our go-to name when we're trying to give staff an example of, boy age 15 dealing with X mental health issues so we can learn and
He's
train
our
the staff.
go-to.
Timmy is the name we just used to fill in the blank.
Yes, not a real person.
Not a real person.
No.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we're not violating any confidentiality.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to wrap it up for today. Again, we're going to put links in the show notes, especially for the Surgeon General's document. We'll put a link in for that, as well as some other helpful links. I want to thank everyone for listening today. Please, as always, just encourage you to subscribe on our YouTube channel and leave some comments. Give us some feedback. We're trying to be a little bit more interactive with people. So if you have questions or comments about any of the topics or things we've covered today, we would love to kind of engage with you on that and establish a dialogue, because I think that's part of the solution. So I want to thank everyone for listening today for this episode of the Grim Drive podcast on youth mental health, specifically the youth mental health epidemic. We'll be back next week to talk about confidence.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.